All right, everybody. This is your Gaza War Sit Rep day 202. I'd say no end in sight. Interesting notes from Hamas spokespeople in the past couple days about Turkish proposal for my ring light has gone off, you guys. My ring light is dying. I will be getting a new one. I've ordered one, but well, this may have been the last. Okay, I'll keep turning it on, but it's dying. So apologies for that. Yes, a possible thing, but then a deal or a proposal for a demilitarized Hamas and a two-state solution. And Hamas, I think, kind of cleverly took it as, sure, we'll be happy to demilitarize in the event of a solution. Because there will be a national army in place. And so I think the Americans have often said, we could have a demilitarized Palestinian state, something like the Palestinian Authority that exists in the West Bank today. But I mean, it's pretty clear that as long as there's an Israel that's armed to the teeth, it's probably safest for the Palestinians to have as powerful an army as possible as well. Otherwise, when one side has an army and the other does not, and you have and one side, the side with the army is the genocidal, racist one, you get a genocide, which is what we have right now. So obviously that's not going to work. That's not going to be the basis for a long-term settlement. And the other thing on the kind of negotiations front, or the prisoner front, is that there was a new wave of demonstrations in Israel because the Hamas's armed wing, the Qassam brigades, released a video of an Israeli prisoner talking directly to the camera and saying, you should be ashamed of yourself, Netanyahu. This was a prisoner who lost a hand on October 7th, and he's on camera kind of admonishing Netanyahu and the government for basically abandoning him, which is precisely what has been done by the Israelis. They've abandoned those prisoners to the same fate that they're exerting on the Palestinians, which is basically a genocide. They've abandoned them to an Israeli-inflicted bombing, to an Israeli-inflicted starvation. I should also continue some reporting on the university intifada, which is what apparently Palestinians are calling it. There was a statement. I wanted to shout out Emory University in particular. I mean, there are 38 colleges and universities in the United States now with encampments. Brown, California State, City University of New York, Columbia, Emerson College, Emory University, Florida International, Florida State, George Washington, Harvard, Indiana, New York University, Northeastern, Northwestern, Ohio State, Princeton, Rice, Texas A&M, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Michigan State, the New School, University of Michigan, Tufts, University of, I'll just name the states, okay, instead of saying university over and over. Arizona, California at Berkeley, Maryland, Miami, Minnesota, New Mexico, North Carolina at Charlotte, North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Pittsburgh, Rochester, Southern California, Texas, Austin, Texas, Dallas. And then we have Vanderbilt University and Yale. So 38. And among these, I wanted to especially shout out Emory University because they just had a really breathtaking statement, because they said, they're calling protesters outside agitators. And so we want to say as clearly as possible, we welcome outside agitators to our struggle against the ruthless genocide of Palestinians. They talk about how exclusive Emory University is, the highest tuition, the lowest acceptance rate. Economic barriers, racist standardized testing, and nepotism have barred many from studying. To students in Atlanta and beyond, we invite you to struggle with us. To local high school students and teachers, we invite you to struggle with us. They talk about how Emory has gentrified the neighborhood through various real estate schemes that a lot of universities are involved in. If you read Davarian Baldwin's book, he's been on the podcast, I think a couple of years ago now, talking about what universities have become and how they're more like investment vehicles than educational institutions now. And they say, you know, Emory University purchased this building that used to be a homeless shelter, and to those without homes or those displaced by gentrification, we invite you to struggle with us. So restaurant workers, house cleaners, proletarians, we invite you to struggle with us, laid off or furloughed. They had layoffs of 1,500 employees. They invite them to struggle with them. It's just a really, they kind of remind you step by step of all the bad things that the university's been involved in, and kind of invite the victims of those to and, you know, kind of finally, like in April 2023, Emory called the police to break up a protest led by students against Cop City on the Quad. To all of those who struggle against police brutality, we invite you to struggle with us. So wanted to say what a great statement. And I've seen some real horrific images from there, as well as other places, of the police, you know, who are building this Cop City in Atlanta to practice counterinsurgency against students, and now they're getting their thrills practicing it on the students in Atlanta. So yeah, just wanted to say, talk, comment, report on the expanding university intifada and the amazing statement by Emory University. In Ontario, you may have seen the amazing Sarah Jama once again in the news after being censured and thrown out of her party for taking an early anti-genocide stand. Now is there's been a CAFA ban. That's the levels of absurdity that we've reached in Ontario. The Ontario legislature has banned the CAFA. And so Sarah Jama came to the Ontario legislature wearing one, and she was expelled, but not before you have this incredible school marm style picture of, I guess, the Speaker of the House. And just to look at the body language of, I mean, everybody involved in this photo is pretty extraordinary. You have look at this guy's posture. Look at his posture. His hands behind his back. It's just repulsive. And then you have Sarah Jama, dignified as always. Look at the pages, body language, everybody else pretending not to see, or nothing's going on there. So that's the state of Canada, not a very good state. The state of Ontario, the biggest province in Canada. Pretty sorry state. So back to the news from the fronts. Yemen. Okay, Yemen has been very active. Ansar Allah has been very militarily active. They've hit a US destroyer. They've hit another Israeli ship, I think for the second time. They said it's called the Darwin, the MSC Darwin. They hit it in the Gulf of Aden with missiles and drones. They fired ballistic and cruise missiles towards the Israeli port of Eilat, and they downed another multi-million-dollar MQ-9 Reaper drone. So these drones, both the Israeli Hermes drones and the American MQ-9 drones, have become basically sitting ducks. They're now just regularly being taken down and shot out of the sky. These extremely expensive drones that are, you know, basically planes that carry missiles. Malik Houthi, the leader of Ansar Allah, he made a speech. He always gives numbers. He reported an 80% reduction of US ships going through the Red Sea, a 300% increase in container shipping costs in Britain. And he concluded, as he always does, that the solution is to stop the crimes of genocide and blockade, and there will be no other solution to this issue. Lebanon. Okay, Lebanon front is absolutely heating up. It is heating up. The Israelis have done like 14 airstrikes, I think, today in the past day or two, and in, you know, I guess they would say in response to the attack on that headquarters that happened, and then the follow-up ambush. There was another major ambush today at the town of Ruwaysat. I don't know if it's a town. I think it's a base. Ruwaysat al-Alam in the Sheba Farms area. Hezbollah has been hitting this site for months. If you look at the daily reports, Ruwaysat al-Alam in Sheba Farms is always being hit. But this is a major ambush. They say that it was hit by guided missiles, artillery, and rockets against the Golani Brigade again. They say they completely destroyed an armored force and a truck. And that's not all they did today. They also hit Zabdin Barracks, Ain Margaliot, Dahira, Malikia with artillery, drones, rockets. So Lebanon is, if I had to guess, I would say tomorrow's going to be even bigger than it was today. The war on the Lebanon-Israel border is getting hotter and hotter. The West Bank, confrontation in Balata. Balata camp is close to Nablus, with bullets and explosive devices by Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades. Tulkarm, the resistance in Tulkarm reports attacking a settlement of Beit Hefer and saying this is just the beginning. And then we have Gaza. Soraya Al-Quds reports bombarding soldiers on the Netzarim axis. There's a kind of I don't know what you call it, a salacious report in the cradle of an Israeli soldier who apparently shared intelligence on the locations of Iron Dome batteries with an Iranian agent who was posing as a attractive dating prospect on Facebook. And I would say, reading the signs, I told you that if I thought an attack on Rafah was coming, it wouldn't come out of nowhere. And I do think there are some signs that there are military preparations for an attack on Rafah happening. So they've been warning, rumbling, talking about it. Netanyahu's been talking about it for months, but just looking at the way things are moving, they're talking about mobilizing units and so on. It could be all misdirection because they want to start something bigger on the Lebanon front, because the Lebanon front is certainly getting big, whether they want it or not. But they also could be, there's several things that they've been trying that haven't worked out quite well. Obviously, the attack on Iran with the quadcopters seemed to fizzle to nothing. I also think that they could have intended to do a bigger attack in the north on Beit Hanun that also fizzled to nothing, when they maybe expected Hamas or the resistance to be more degraded than it was. And it could be something similar in Rafah, or it could be that they're planning a big attack in Rafah, because I've never thought that it was just a bluff. So I am watching as carefully as I can for signs that there is going to be a real attack on Rafah. And I do see signs that they're building up to something, whether it's going to be in the north or whether it is going to be this attack on Rafah. I do see some signals of something real. I will continue to follow it and give you anything more concrete than this general intuitive sense that I have. There's also an interesting there's a really good blogger, a really good writer named Indrajit. Let me just make sure I get his name. Indrajit Samarajiva. And you can find it at indica.medium.com. And I think on Twitter it's Indica, INDICA. And he's great anti-imperialist writer, writes very, very frequently. He writes on Medium. He hasn't, I don't think he's made the switch to Substack that most of us have made, but he writes on Medium. And it's he's got a really great article. I'll just show you the screenshot, called Why or How. He's got an article called Why America's Military is Falling Apart. And then he's got an article called how America's military is falling apart, crashing planes, burning ships, and accounting fraud. And what I find, what's pertinent, I mean, there's everything in this article is great, and it's really well written and funny, and he's a great writer. But what he's talking about that's really pertinent is this issue of the US pier. You know, John and I have been reporting on this pier, and where's the pier? And the pier is supposed to be here by now. And Indy, as he goes by Indy, he says that it's actually just sheer logistical issues that have delayed this pier. He said, here's the section. It's called Burning Ships in the article. He says, as part of their charade of giving a shit, America was building a pier in Gaza, but they can't even get ships across the Atlantic. Like their Red Sea fleet that slunk away in defeat, the Gaza flotilla caught fire before they even got there. The aptly named John P. Bobo caught fire and had to turn around. And he links this story, which, I mean, it's a YouTube video. I haven't watched it, but this is a YouTube video called USNS LT John P. Bobo has engine fire and aborts Gaza mission from 8 days ago. The channel is called What's Going On with Shipping, and ship aborts Gaza mission. So that's the link. Again, I haven't watched the video, but sounds plausible. But then another ship, the Besson had some issue and never made it past the Azores. The Wilson Wharf never made it past the Canary Islands. The Lopez slowed down, indicating some issue, but made it in the end. These are not isolated issues. The USNS Buttons caught fire a few weeks ago. The US Navy is literally on fire. And so is this why the Navy pier hasn't come through? I thought it was more of an intellectual problem of not knowing what to do when they got there, but maybe it was actually that their logistics are their ships and their navy is in such bad repair that they couldn't even get there because of fires and things like that. I don't know. Anyway, it's one possible explanation for a open question or a mystery that of why the pier hasn't materialized beyond just nobody knowing what the pier was for or what it was going to do, which is also a reasonable, plausible theory for why it hasn't materialized. But I think with that, I can conclude the news portion of today's sit rep. And now, if you haven't read my Substack from last night, I'd like to do a bit of a deep dive into the issue of nonviolence. I promised this some time ago, and I finally finished the article. Yesterday, I sat down to work on it, thinking I was going to put on an hour or two of work. And instead, I just kept going and just finished the article and sent it out. So what we have now is an article called Palestine. I'll show it to you. It's called Palestine 2018 Proved the Futility of Anti-Colonial Nonviolence. And so what I did in this article was I talk about how the Indian independence struggle was an armed struggle. The US struggle for civil rights was an armed struggle. I talk about all the armed components of that, the Deacons for Defense, the Mississippi Regional Council of Negro Leadership, Robert Williams of Monroe, North Carolina, the riots in Albany, Georgia, and Birmingham, Georgia. So in the Indian freedom struggle, I talk about the Hindustan Republican Army, the Telangana Uprising, the Tufan Sena, the Indian National Army, and the Naval Mutiny. So all of these violent, organized, armed, violent moments of these supposedly nonviolent struggles. And then the next thing I do is I take apart a book by academics Erica Chenoweth and Maria J. Steffen. And they have a book called Why Civil Resistance Works. And their claim in the book is, if you're trying to do a regime change operation, if you're a revolutionary in a country in the world, your chances of success are higher if you adopt a nonviolent strategy than if you adopt a violent strategy. And so what they do is they compile a database of a couple of hundred revolutions. They code them as successful or non-successful or limited success. And then they code them as violent and nonviolent. And then they find that the nonviolent success, there are more nonviolent successes. The ratio of success to failure is higher if you're nonviolent. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of take this apart or take this question on. But what I did was I looked at the nonviolent successes, because this is how the database looks, you guys. I'll just show you, because it's a spreadsheet. It's a proper database, right? So you have outcome, right? Peak membership, location, campaign, target. You have whether it was non-violent, non-viol, whether it was violent, viol. You have whether it was a regime change type or a secession type, whether it was success or failure, whether it was in the Middle East, I mean, by continent. So there's a bunch of other data here. But I looked at non-violent and violent, and I looked at success and failure, and I stuck to the non-violent successes, because non-violent failures don't prove their point. Violent failures and violent successes don't prove their point. I need to look at the historical background of non-violent successes. And there were 57 of them. But when you go through them and you group them by continent, well, a lot of the 14 of the 57 non-violent successes are what you might call East European color revolutions. So sponsored by the likes of the National Endowment for Democracy, the International Republican Institute, the Soros Institute. So United States organizations giving money to people to train them in media practice, to train them in political organizing. And then they go and they do these demonstrations and these media work, and they try to overthrow the government of these countries. So you have everything from Germany, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Russia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan. And then they also code as nonviolent successes 1999 Croatia, 2000 Yugoslavia, and 1989 Slovenia. These are actual civil wars situations that resulted in the violent dismembering of the country. The 1990 Russia nonviolent revolution led to the biggest drop in life expectancy in, I think, human history up to that point. The most people leaving the middle class in human history in that up to that point. So that's East Europe. Africa, they had plenty of outright violent struggles that were armed struggles that were coded as nonviolent, including the South African anti-apartheid struggle, which had an armed wing called Umkhonto Wesizwe. In East Asia, there were many guerrilla movements. East Timor, which suffered an outright genocide. These are coded as nonviolent successes. Latin America, guerrilla struggles, armed struggles, coded as nonviolent struggles. And same in Europe, military defections, military coups, all coded as nonviolent successes. And then there is one set of about 8 examples, 8 cases of nonviolent successes where there's like a long-running kind of moribund dictatorship that's ran out of steam after a few decades, and the people non-violently forced that regime to hold an election. And that's coded as a non-violent revolution. It is basically non-violent, and they did succeed. So I think I'll give them that. But that does not prove anything like the thesis that non-violence has a more chance of success. All it proves is that under those right circumstances, a non-violent people's mobilization can force a regime to hold an election if it doesn't want to initially. So what I'm trying to do is get away from the idea that there's you can as a revolutionary say, okay, here I am, I'm going to embark on a revolution. Do I choose from the menu to order a nonviolent revolution, or do I choose from the menu to order a violent revolution? It does not work that way at all. What I see even in the data presented by Chenoweth and Stefan here is that there are some circumstances where you can keep a social conflict on the nonviolent plane. And I think the circumstances, and I'm still working through this, but I think roughly the circumstances are where the elite, it depends on how deeply the elite is invested in the policy that you're trying to change as a revolutionary. So if it's a policy like, a stoplight or a speed bump that you want, or a municipal garbage collection, or better wages and working conditions, then you can probably win that non-violently. And after all, every collective agreement, every free and fair election, every every negotiated settlement of any kind, and every legal case that happens, every time lawyers hammer something out in court or out of court, those are all nonviolent conflicts that were solved, right? They're all nonviolent successes for one side, at least. But so there are millions and millions of nonviolent successes all the time. But when you have groups of people who recognize one another's humanity, you can probably keep it nonviolent. And that's why, you can have marriage counseling. That's why you can have successful mediation between neighbors. But what you can't have is when you can't have a nonviolent resolution to a racism-based conflict where one side believes in their own racial superiority and has demonized or dehumanized the other side. And so if you're talking about an indigenous struggle for land, if you're talking about an anti-apartheid struggle, or both, that's not going to be resolved in a nonviolent way. It never has been. Whatever this database tries to mislead you, however much they ignore the armed elements of the Indian freedom struggle or the civil rights struggle in the US, it is historically not the case that there has been a nonviolent anti-colonial struggle. And that is why, in the case of Palestine, there has been decades and effort and ink spilled trying to make the Palestinians into nonviolent subjects. And the leader of this effort was probably as Marcy Smith called him, the most important defense intellectual you've never heard of, which is Gene Sharp. Gene Sharp was a Harvard intellectual whose thing was trying to get nonviolent movements going, especially in countries that are targeted by the US as strategically important. So a lot of the East European color revolutions have a gene sharp footprint or fingerprint on them. And the Gene Sharp also had a lot to say about the Palestinian struggle. So in 1989, he wrote this article about the Intifada, the first Intifada, 1987 to 1989. And he was talking about the Intifada and non-violent struggle. He says 85% of total resistance was non-violent, but they need to go and make it 100%. And it's just one of these things where it reminds me of some of our intellectuals today, where they just they present just assertions as if they're just facts. So like, two major facts must be recognized, he says. Israelis who have so long sought a homeland and a haven from persecution are not going to pack their bags and return to the countries where they or their ancestors once lived. Second, the Palestinians are not going away either. So they're going to continue the Intifada until they get their independence and respect, the same as the Israelis enjoy. So he talks about how they have to split Israeli public opinion, contribute to splits within the Israeli political establishment, the partial split between the Israeli and the United States government, to encourage world opinion and diplomatic efforts to help settle the conflict. So this is what he says the Palestinians need to do. And this is why he says Palestinians need to stop stone throwing. He said stone throwing gets Palestinians killed. He basically absolves the Israelis of any responsibility here, right? He says, look, Palestinian victims, stone throwing is guaranteed to produce high Palestinian casualties. Stone throwing is almost guaranteed to produce high Palestinian casualties. You see what he did there? Stone throwing produces casualties. What is the mechanism by which these casualties are produced? The Israelis, he says, can almost never see a stone thrown at them as a relatively nonviolent expression of rage. The stones are instead seen as more threats to the lives of Jews, calling up memories of past persecutions, pogroms, and the Holocaust, and hence triggering highly disproportionate and irrational responses. You see how this, like all nonviolence, absolves the oppressor of actual rational, cold-blooded, cruel oppression. It's just there. You got to understand these people have memories of persecution, and so they, so the person who's responsible for fighting back, the person who's fighting back is responsible for whatever the oppressor does to them. It's astounding. And in a context like reading this today in the context of a genocide is absolutely vulgar. He says, and then he suggests some tactics, and the tactics he suggests is a 21-day hunger strike. And then he also thinks that after the hunger strike, he says Palestinians should do some whistling and wailing at night, especially in dark streets, and maybe have the youth standing peacefully holding small Palestinian flags with their right hands outstretched in a gesture of friendship. There are doubtless, he says, other options. So that's Gene Sharp trying to get the Palestinians to be nonviolent. And of course, there were many Palestinians who responded to this call. They were nonviolent. There's been a huge nonviolent struggle, according to, and I don't just mean, everyday nonviolence of normal human beings who don't, resort to violence except in extreme circumstances, which is precisely how normal human beings behave. But I'm talking about nonviolence according to this Gene Sharp principle. And lots of people died trying to do nonviolence. International solidarity movement people died trying to do nonviolent struggle in Palestine. It didn't divide Israeli society. The Israeli society holds pancake parties to celebrate the murder of Rachel Corrie, one of the International Solidarity Movement activists, who was murdered by a bulldozer running over her. They hold a pancake breakfast party to celebrate her murder. So they're not divided. They're not dividing. There's no sharpening the contradictions by moving the consciences of Israelis through nonviolence. But really, what I say in the Substack article is the culmination of the whole nonviolence in Palestine thing it was the Great March of Return. So the so-called Great March of Return, and there's another article in the Journal of Palestine Studies that I cite in my Substack. It's a very good article about the Great March of Return. It's called The Great March of Return, An Organizer's Perspective by Jihad Abu Salim. And Jihad Abu Salim argues, has a extensive article, extensive, I think, interviews with one of the organizers of the Great March of Return. So the Great March of Return is this march, a massive nonviolent march to the fence in Gaza in March of 2018. So I guess 6 years ago now. And and tens of thousands over months and months marched to the fence, and Israeli snipers basically just picked them off. The first day, they killed 17 Palestinians and injured 1,400 others. The estimates of what they did over the course of the entire March of Return is 226 the snipers killed and tens of thousands, maybe like 30,000 that they injured. And this is just like an infographic of where people were killed, all these different areas, all these different places. They killed them all along the fence, okay? And they injured them all along the fence. And methodical, systematic injuries. One of the most brutal, this was the most brutal suppression of nonviolent movement ever, and it was, I think, definitive, and it made absolutely no division in Israeli society or any of Israel's Western backers. All of them just were completely fine with it. Maybe a little bit of took a little bit of sadistic pleasure in it, I would say, and learned that there would be absolutely no consequences for committing mass murder against Palestinians in front of the cameras, in front of the world. So that was the Great March of Return. I would say that the Great March of Return of 2018 should be the absolute last time anyone advocates for nonviolent struggle in a colonial context. That was a perfect scientific experiment in whether nonviolence works or not in this context, and the answer is not. And I think that's what I said in the Substack, and I think that's what was proven here. And so now, today, we have the armed struggle going on in Palestine, and now it's expanded. It's in Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen is involved, Iran is involved, Syria is involved, and on the Israeli side, the entire West is suppressing all pro-Palestine, banning the CAFA, invading campuses with cavalry, putting snipers on campus buildings. So we have a real we have a really massive struggle now, and it is not a nonviolent struggle. Although, there will be, as I concluded my Substack with a note that there will be a reopening of the nonviolence debate in North American context, because with 38 encampments and growing, and the ruling class being completely irrational, violent, repressive, mendacious, like complete lies, complete utter lies, and the vilest lies with no consequences from the highest levels of government and media about protesters, about the protests. Like, it's illegitimate to be anti-genocide, and according to the elites of these countries, and it's perfectly normal to be doing genocide according to them. So that's but so the question is, what is the level of elite investment in genocide? How important is it for these campuses to be invested in companies that are committing genocide and providing the weaponry to commit genocide in Israel? How important is it for these universities to maintain these investment portfolios? How important is it for these politicians to maintain a complete diplomatic support for Israel as it commits this genocide? That's a question, because that level of investment is what will determine how violent their response is, which is already pretty violent. We've seen the police violence against protesters. But it's them that decide. Like, theorists of social struggle have always said that. Like, it's the oppressor that decides whether a contest is going to be violent or non-violent, right? We are all part of the same society. It isn't an ethnic conflict between protesters and police, right? I mean, Columbia University, these are elite universities. These are the children of the same elites. So it isn't exactly like these elites are not trying to steal their land or settle on their land, although there have been some scenes of police occupying the very grounds, evicting the protesters from the university in California, and then occupying the grounds and locking the students out. So there are some weird things going on for sure. But what I'm saying is, this is not a conflict. The conflict between anti-genocide protesters and campus administrations is not an ethnic conflict. It's not a racialized conflict, exactly. Although, again, one has to nuance these kinds of statements, but it's not analogous to the Israel-Palestine conflict, where Israel is trying to steal their land and impose an apartheid system on them. It's a conflict over policy, and therefore the nonviolence debate is one that arises, and maybe this is one that can be resolved nonviolently. I certainly would personally count myself as among those working for that outcome. So that's what I wanted to say tonight about nonviolence. I'll have some other thoughts about about different elements, different talking points, different facts and factual, what do we call it, departures from facts that are being used to demonize the students and the protesters. I will continue to follow this and work on those in the sit reps ahead. I've been thinking about things like, just maybe giving people more background on Hamas and the 2017 charter, and 1948. There's all kinds of things that I'm reading and that I can do deep dives on in the coming days. So I will leave it there. Hang in there. Like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next.